People think the worst part about being an orphan is loneliness, but loneliness was never the thing that scared me the most. Hunger was worse than loneliness. Knowing that nobody in the entire world cared whether I ate that day was worse than loneliness. Waking up every morning and realizing that if I failed to find work before sunset, I would simply go to sleep hungry again was far worse than anything loneliness could ever do to a person. I lived in a refugee camp on the outskirts of the city, although calling it a camp almost felt generous because it was little more than hundreds of worn-out tents spread across a field of dirt and mud. Nobody even remembered why the camp was originally built. Some people claimed it was created after a war that happened years before I was born, while others believed it was meant to house victims of famine and displacement. Whatever the reason was, the camp had long since become a dumping ground for people the world had forgotten. My home was a small tent near the edge of the camp where the fabric walls had been patched so many times that there were almost more repairs than original material left. During the rainy season, water leaked through the ceiling and forced me to move around in the darkness searching for whichever corner was driest. During the dry season, the heat trapped inside became unbearable and turned the tent into an oven by midday. I woke up that morning just before 6 as the sounds of coughing, crying children, and people arguing over water supplies slowly spread through the camp. The first thing I noticed was the familiar pain in my stomach, reminding me that I had gone to sleep without dinner once again. That feeling was not unusual anymore. Hunger had become such a normal part of my life that sometimes I only noticed it when it disappeared. I stepped outside and looked around the camp as people began preparing for another day of survival. Mothers carried empty containers toward the water station, while fathers searched for temporary jobs that barely paid enough to keep their families alive for another 24 hours. Children who should have been in schools wandered through the camp barefoot, while elderly men sat outside their tents staring into the distance, as if they had already accepted that life was never going to improve. Unlike most people there, I had nobody. No parents, no relatives, no older brother looking out for me, no younger sibling depending on me. I was completely alone. If I disappeared that day, there would probably be nobody left alive who even knew my name. That thought used to scare me when I was younger, but eventually it became strangely comforting because you cannot disappoint people who expect nothing from you. My routine never changed. Every morning I walked nearly 40 minutes to a logging settlement near the forest where an old man occasionally paid me for labor that nobody else wanted to do. The pay was terrible, and the work was exhausting, but it was enough to buy bread and sometimes a proper meal if I was lucky. By 7 in the morning, I finally arrived at the workshop. The old man was already waiting beside a pile of freshly delivered timber that looked large enough to keep us busy for days. His name was Mr. Rowland. He was probably somewhere in his 70s, although his face looked old enough to belong to a man who had lived 2 lifetimes instead of 1. His beard had turned completely white years ago, and his hands looked more like tree bark than skin after spending decades working with wood. He immediately noticed that I had arrived slightly later than usual and asked what had delayed me. After explaining that the crowd near the water station had blocked the shortest route out of the camp, he reminded me that timber would not split itself, and that if delays were becoming common, I needed to start leaving earlier regardless of whatever obstacles appeared along the way. I apologized and assured him it would not happen again before grabbing an axe and getting to work. The first task involved moving large logs from the delivery pile to the splitting area near the workshop. Some of those logs were so heavy that I had to roll them across the ground instead of carrying them. After that came the actual splitting. Mr. Rowland handled the largest pieces himself while I worked on the smaller logs using an old axe that had probably seen more years of service than I had been alive. Every swing sent vibrations through my arms while wood chips flew into my face and clothes. By midday, my hands had already started blistering. Unfortunately, splitting the wood was only the beginning. Once the logs had been cut into smaller pieces, I stacked them beside the storage shed according to size before sweeping away sawdust that covered almost every surface inside the workshop. After that came carrying broken pieces of timber to the disposal pile and organizing tools that previous workers had left scattered around the yard. The work never seemed to end. At some point during the afternoon, Mr. Rowland handed me a piece of bread and a bottle of water before sitting beneath a nearby tree to rest his back. As I ate, he asked whether I had ever considered leaving the refugee camp behind and trying to start a new life somewhere else. I told him that I thought about it almost every day, but the problem was that leaving required money and opportunities, 2 things I had never possessed in my entire life. He listened quietly before explaining that sometimes people spend so much time trying to escape bad situations that they accidentally run straight into worse ones, without realizing it, until it is too late. At the time, I thought he was simply talking like old people usually do. Later that night, I realized he might have been the smartest man I had ever met. The afternoon disappeared beneath hours of lifting, carrying, stacking, cleaning, and splitting until eventually the sun began lowering toward the horizon. My shoulders burned, my arms felt numb. My clothes were soaked with sweat. Even breathing felt exhausting. Finally, just as I was beginning to wonder whether there would be any work left for tomorrow, Mr. Rowland reached into his pocket and handed me the payment for the day. The amount was small. To most people, it would probably have looked insignificant. To me, it was survival. That money represented dinner tonight and breakfast tomorrow morning. That money represented another day of staying alive. I thanked him before beginning the long walk back toward the refugee camp, as the evening sun painted the sky orange above the trees. As I walked, I remember feeling strangely optimistic. For the first time in weeks, I had enough money to eat properly. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that maybe life was finally beginning to improve. I had absolutely no idea that within a few hours, I would be standing in the middle of an abandoned town surrounded by hundreds of desperate people fighting for their lives, while wealthy strangers placed bets on who would survive until sunrise. If someone had told me that morning how my day was going to end, I would have laughed in their face and continued walking home. Unfortunately, some nightmares do not announce themselves before they arrive. Sometimes they simply wait patiently for nightfall. I left Mr. Rowland's workshop with the money folded carefully inside my pocket and started the familiar journey back toward the refugee camp, as the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees surrounding the logging settlement. The air felt cooler than it had earlier in the day, and for the first time in weeks, I found myself thinking about food instead of work. The amount I earned was not much by normal standards, but to someone living in a refugee camp, that money represented comfort, security, and the promise that I would not have to go to bed hungry that night. I remember checking my pocket at least 5 times during the walk home just to make sure the money was still there. That was how valuable it was to me. The road connecting the settlement to the camp was mostly empty during the evening. A few old vehicles occasionally passed by, but most people avoided traveling that route after sunset because robberies had become increasingly common over the years. Unfortunately, desperation creates predators just as easily as it creates victims. By the time I reached the old drainage bridge that marked the final 15 minutes before the camp entrance, the sun had almost completely disappeared below the horizon, and the shadows around me had grown longer and darker. That was when I noticed them. 4 men were standing beside the road near the bridge, pretending to talk among themselves, while occasionally glancing in my direction. At first I told myself I was overthinking the situation. People stood near roads all the time. People talked. People waited for friends. There was no reason to assume the worst. Then one of them stepped directly into my path. He looked roughly 30 years old and wore clothes that were somehow in worse condition than my own. His beard had not been trimmed in months, and his eyes carried the same exhausted anger I had seen on the faces of people who had spent too long losing battles against life. He asked whether I had any money. I immediately lied and told him I had spent everything already. The moment the words left my mouth, the expression on his face changed. He knew I was lying. Before I could react, the other 3 men had already surrounded me. One grabbed my shoulder while another searched my pockets. I tried pushing past them. That was my mistake. The first punch landed directly against my cheek and nearly knocked me to the ground. The second hit my stomach hard enough to force the air from my lungs. After that, the attack became chaos. Fists struck my face. Boots slammed into my ribs. Hands pulled at my clothes while someone ripped the money from my pocket. I remember falling to the ground and covering my head while praying they would stop before they decided killing me was easier than leaving witnesses behind. The beating felt endless. At one point, I tasted blood in my mouth. At another point, I became convinced one of my ribs had cracked. Eventually, the attack stopped. One of the men warned me not to follow them before they disappeared into the darkness with the money I had spent the entire day earning. I stayed on the ground for several minutes staring at the sky, while trying to remember how breathing was supposed to work. My left eye had started swelling shut. My lip was split open. Blood dripped steadily from my nose onto the dirt beneath me. I'd been poor my entire life, but something about lying there in the middle of the road after being beaten for the tiny amount of money I managed to earn that day broke something inside me. I was angry. Not the kind of anger that makes people shout. The kind that sits quietly inside your chest and slowly convinces you that the world has declared war against you personally. Eventually, I forced myself back to my feet. Every step hurt. My ribs screamed every time I breathed too deeply. My legs felt unstable beneath me. The camp entrance was only 15 minutes away, but that walk felt longer than the entire journey from the workshop. By the time I finally reached the rows of tents surrounding the camp, the sky above me had already turned dark. Nobody paid attention to the blood on my clothes. Nobody asked what happened. That might sound cruel, but refugee camps teach people very quickly to focus on surviving their own disasters before worrying about somebody else's. I finally reached my tent sometime around 5 in the evening and sat down outside the entrance while using water from an old container to clean the blood from my face. The bruises were already beginning to darken. My left cheek had swollen noticeably. Even touching my ribs sent sharp pain through my chest. As I sat there cleaning dried blood from my hands, I remember wondering what exactly I had done to deserve a life where even earning money honestly resulted in getting beaten and robbed before reaching home. That was when I noticed him. A man wearing a dark coat and an old hat was standing several meters away watching me in complete silence. I had no idea at the time that meeting him would become the single most expensive moment of my entire life. Because some decisions cost far more than money. Some decisions cost pieces of your soul. At first I assumed the man was simply another volunteer worker passing through the camp, or maybe someone looking for a relative among the refugees. But the longer I looked at him, the more uncomfortable I became. He was standing perfectly still several meters away from my tent with his hands behind his back, as if he had been watching me for quite some time before I finally noticed him. The strange thing was not his clothes. The refugee camp saw all kinds of people. Aid workers came and went. Government officials occasionally appeared for inspections. Journalists visited whenever another crisis became popular enough for the news. What unsettled me was the fact that this man looked completely out of place. His coat was too clean. His shoes were too expensive. Even the hat resting on his head looked like something from another world entirely. He belonged in an office building somewhere in the city. He did not belong standing beside a torn refugee tent while staring at a bruised orphan cleaning blood from his face. He slowly approached me and asked whether I had ever wondered what my life would look like if money stopped being a problem. I remember almost laughing. Money had been a problem every single day of my life. Money decided whether I ate. Money decided whether I slept hungry. Money decided whether I survived the week. Asking me whether I wanted money felt almost insulting. I told him that everybody wanted money, and that if he was trying to sell something, he had chosen the wrong customer because I could barely afford food. Instead of leaving, he looked directly at the bruises on my face and calmly pointed out that someone had already taken the little money I did have, despite the fact that I earned it honestly. The fact that he immediately understood what had happened unsettled me. I asked him how he knew. He simply said that desperate people often become predictable. Then he asked me a question that caught me completely off guard. He asked how much money it would take to completely change my life forever. I told him that for someone like me, even $10,000 would probably feel life-changing. He smiled slightly before telling me that the opportunity he was offering involved far more money than that. I immediately assumed he was some kind of scam artist. Nobody walks into a refugee camp looking for homeless orphans to make rich. That simply does not happen. I told him as much and explained that if he was planning to ask for registration fees or personal information, he was wasting his time. Instead of becoming offended, he reached into his pocket and placed a folded piece of paper beside me. He explained that there would be 10 games. Each game carried a reward of $1 million for surviving it. Anyone who survived all 10 games would walk away with $10 million. $10 million. The number sounded ridiculous. I had never even seen $10,000 in my entire life. The idea that someone was casually offering $10 million to strangers sounded absurd. I immediately asked why he was not participating himself if the rewards were real. He explained that he used to be involved years earlier, but that age and health had removed that option from him. According to him, his current role involved finding people who had nothing left to lose and presenting them with an opportunity most people would never receive. The explanation sounded rehearsed. Too rehearsed. I asked what the games involved. He told me that confidentiality was part of the agreement and that participants only received full details after arriving at the venue. I asked how many people would be participating. He simply replied that there would be enough participants to make things interesting. That answer should have been enough to send me away immediately. Instead, I kept listening. That was mistake number one. The man eventually handed me the folded paper and explained that if I was interested, I needed to arrive at the address before 7 o'clock, because transportation to the venue would begin shortly afterward, and the games themselves would start precisely at 8:30 in the evening. Then he turned around and walked away. No pressure, no sales pitch, no attempts to convince me. He simply disappeared into the camp as if he had already done his job. I unfolded the paper and stared at the address for several minutes. Part of me knew the entire thing was suspicious. Nobody gives strangers millions of dollars. Nobody creates competitions with rewards larger than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Every instinct I possessed told me to throw the paper away and forget the conversation ever happened. Then I looked around the camp. I looked at the leaking tents. I looked at children fighting over scraps of food. I looked down at my bruised hands and swollen face after being beaten for money that would not even cover a wealthy person's dinner bill. Suddenly the decision became more complicated, because when you have everything to lose, taking risks feels foolish. But when you have nothing to lose, taking risks starts feeling reasonable. I checked the time. Just after 6 o'clock, less than 2 hours remained before the games were supposed to begin. I sat outside my tent for nearly 30 minutes debating with myself. One part of me screamed that this was obviously a scam. Another part reminded me that scams usually target people with money. I had nothing, no savings, no family, no future. What exactly was there left to steal? Eventually I stood up and brushed the dirt from my clothes. I told myself that I would simply visit the address and leave immediately if anything felt wrong. I convinced myself that there was no harm in looking. That became mistake number 2. The address led me to an old warehouse district near the industrial edge of the city, where abandoned factories stretched for blocks in every direction. The area was almost completely deserted by the time I arrived. Waiting outside one of the warehouses stood the man with the hat. Beside him were several large vehicles and at least a dozen men wearing black clothing who watched silently as participants continued arriving from different directions. Some looked homeless. Some looked desperate. Some looked frightened. Most looked exactly like people who needed money badly enough to ignore their instincts. The man with the hat greeted me as if he had expected me all along, and explained that once transportation began, participants would not be allowed to leave until orientation was complete. The wording bothered me. Orientation sounded too formal, too organized. I asked one final time what exactly we were signing up for. He looked directly into my eyes before telling me that opportunities capable of changing lives forever rarely arrive wearing friendly faces. Then he asked whether I still wanted to continue. Looking back now, that was the last chance I had to walk away. I wish I had taken it. Instead, I nodded. One of the men stepped forward and collected my belongings before placing a black blindfold over my eyes. The last thing I saw before darkness covered my vision was the man with the hat, adjusting the brim of his hat and wishing me good luck. The words sounded innocent at the time. Later, I realized they sounded more like condolences. As the vehicle doors closed around us and the engine finally started, I remember wondering what kind of games required blindfolds, armed guards, and secrecy. By the time I learned the answer, turning back was no longer an option. The journey lasted much longer than I expected. With the blindfold covering my eyes, time became difficult to measure and distance became impossible to judge. At first I tried counting seconds in my head so I could estimate how far we had traveled, but somewhere along the way I lost track after the vehicle began turning repeatedly in different directions. Nobody inside the vehicle spoke. Nobody coughed. Nobody moved more than necessary. The only sounds came from the engine beneath us and the occasional bump from rough roads that threw us slightly against our seats. The silence itself felt unnatural. Eventually the vehicle slowed down. The engine died. Doors opened. Hands grabbed my shoulders and guided me outside. Cold air immediately struck my face. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven and cracked as if I was standing on old pavement that had not been maintained in decades. Several seconds later, the blindfold was removed. For a moment, I genuinely thought I was dreaming. We were standing in the middle of an abandoned town. Not abandoned in the normal sense. Not the kind of place where businesses failed and people moved elsewhere. This place looked as though life itself had simply vanished overnight. Buildings surrounded us in every direction with shattered windows and faded signs hanging from rusted supports. Vehicles sat abandoned along the streets with flat tires and broken glass scattered around them. Streetlights stood overhead, yet somehow every single one was functioning perfectly despite the obvious decay surrounding them. Bright white lights illuminated roads that should have been dark. Electricity flowed through buildings that should not have had power. The entire place felt wrong. Artificial, Like a movie set built by someone who understood what abandoned towns looked like but had never actually visited one. Then I noticed the people. Hundreds of them. Everywhere I looked, people filled the streets. Some sat on the sidewalks with frightened expressions. Others stood in groups speaking quietly among themselves. Many simply stared at their surroundings with the same confusion I felt. There had to be at least 400 participants, possibly more. Most looked poor. Many looked homeless. Several wore clothes so damaged that they were barely holding together. One man near me had shoes held together with string. Another participant could not have been older than 18. An elderly woman sat beside a broken fountain, clutching a photograph against her chest, as if it somehow provided comfort. For the first time that night, I began wondering exactly what kind of people accepted invitations from mysterious strangers promising millions of dollars. Then I looked around again. Refugees, homeless people, bankrupt workers, people with nowhere else to go, people exactly like me. The realization settled heavily inside my chest. Whoever organized this place had not selected participants randomly. They had selected desperation. My attention shifted upward after hearing movement above us. That was when I saw them. Large observation platforms had been constructed on top of several buildings overlooking the town square. Inside those platforms sat dozens of wealthy men and women behind thick glass walls, while waiters moved between tables carrying drinks and expensive meals. Some wore suits. Others wore jewelry worth more than everything I had owned in my entire life combined. Several held papers and electronic tablets while pointing toward participants below. One man laughed while shaking hands with another spectator. Another raised a glass toward the crowd beneath him. At first, I could not understand what I was looking at. Then I saw the screens. Massive displays mounted onto nearby buildings showed photographs of participants alongside numbers that constantly changed every few seconds. Names, odds, predictions, betting values. Someone beside me quietly realized the truth before I did. We were not contestants. We were entertainment. People were gambling on our lives. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, movement near the edge of the square caught everyone's attention. A young man had apparently reached the same conclusion before the rest of us. He turned around and started running. Not walking, not hesitating, running. For a brief moment, hope spread through the crowd because if he escaped, maybe all of us could. He never made it more than 20 meters. The gunshot echoed across the entire town. The sound was so sudden and violent that several people screamed. The young man's body collapsed onto the pavement and slid several feet before finally coming to rest near an abandoned car. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even breathed. A second later, another shot rang out. Then silence returned. The message had been delivered. The giant screens flickered. Every light in the town dimmed slightly. Then a voice emerged from hidden speakers positioned throughout the streets. The voice welcomed us to the games and congratulated us for accepting the invitation that had been offered to so few people around the world. It explained that every participant present had been selected because they possessed the qualities necessary to survive extraordinary circumstances. Then came the rules. Leaving the game would result in immediate execution. Attempting to sabotage the game would result in immediate execution. Attacking game officials would result in immediate execution. Only one participant would survive until the end. Only one participant would receive the prize. Everyone else would die. The voice calmly informed us that the first game would begin at exactly 8:30 in the evening and conclude when the required number of survivors remained. The tone was so casual that it somehow made everything worse. There was no anger, no excitement, no cruelty, just professionalism. As if announcing a train schedule instead of a massacre. Panic spread through the crowd almost immediately. People shouted questions. Some demanded to leave. Others begged. Several dropped to their knees crying. The wealthy spectators above us watched everything unfold while waiters continued serving drinks as though they were attending a sporting event. One man pointed toward a crying participant and laughed with the people sitting beside him. Another checked numbers appearing on his screen before apparently placing another bet. That was the moment reality finally struck me. The games had not started yet. People had not even begun dying, and somehow we had already stopped being human in the eyes of the people watching us. We were horses before a race, numbers on a screen. Statistics, investments, walking odds waiting to either increase in value or collapse before the night ended. I looked up at the digital clock mounted above the square. The display read exactly 8:2009 p.m. 1 minute remained before the first game began. 1 minute remained before the longest night of my life officially started. That night would end at exactly 5:30 in the morning. 9 hours. Only 9 hours. Even now, years later, I still cannot explain how 9 hours managed to feel longer than the rest of my entire life combined. The digital clock above the town square finally changed from 8:29 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. At that exact moment, metal shutters slammed down across every street leading out of the square while floodlights illuminated the entire area with enough brightness to turn night into day. The voice returned over the speakers and announced that the first game would be called The Sacrifice. Several large containers rose from beneath the pavement before stopping in the center of the square. When the doors opened, everyone saw the contents: knives, axes, metal pipes, machetes, crowbars. The crowd immediately became restless. The voice then explained the rules. There were 412 participants remaining in the game. By exactly 9:30, only 300 participants could remain alive. If more than 300 participants were still alive when the timer reached 0, automated defenses hidden throughout the town would randomly eliminate enough people to reach the required number. If fewer than 300 remained alive before the timer expired, the game would immediately end and the survivors would proceed to the second round. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody wanted to believe what they had just heard. Then, the giant screens mounted around the square activated. Every participant's photograph appeared on the displays along with a status indicator beside their face. Alive, dead, targeted, protected. At first, nobody understood what those labels meant. Then the voice explained one final rule. Participants who personally eliminated another contestant would receive a protected status for the remainder of the round, and could not be selected by the automated defenses if the timer expired. Suddenly, everything changed. The game organizers had done something terrifyingly clever. They had not simply encouraged violence. They had weaponized fear itself. Nobody wanted to become a killer. Nobody wanted blood on their hands. But nobody wanted to be randomly executed either. Within seconds, panic spread through the square. Some people started crying. Others begged everyone to stay calm and refused to participate. One man climbed onto an abandoned vehicle and shouted that if nobody killed anyone, then the organizers would not be able to force them to play. His speech lasted less than 30 seconds. A rifle shot echoed from somewhere above us. The man collapsed backwards onto the pavement with a hole through the center of his forehead. The screens immediately updated. 411 participants remaining. 300 survivors required. The message was clear. The game would continue with or without our cooperation. The first attack happened less than a minute later. A middle-aged man grabbed one of the metal pipes and swung it into another participant's head with enough force to knock him unconscious instantly. The crowd exploded into chaos. People ran in every direction. Some grabbed weapons for protection. Others grabbed them for entirely different reasons. Within minutes, the town square became a battlefield. The wealthy spectators above us erupted into applause. Numbers flashed across betting screens as odds changed in real time. Contestants who fought aggressively saw their survival odds increase. Contestants who hid saw theirs collapse. Some spectators celebrated kills the same way sports fans celebrate goals. Others argued over statistics while placing larger wagers. I remember looking up and seeing one man in an expensive suit cheering while pointing toward a dying contestant as if he had just won money on a horse race. Maybe he had. I stood frozen in place for several seconds, unable to process what was happening around me. Then somebody crashed into me from behind and nearly knocked me to the ground. When I looked up, I saw a woman sprinting past me while a man carrying a machete chased after her through the square. That was the moment reality finally caught up with me. Nobody was coming to save us. There was no hidden camera, no social experiment, no final reveal. This was real. The game had started. And if I wanted to survive until morning, I was going to have to become someone I had never wanted to be. By the time the first 15 minutes of the game had passed, the town square no longer looked like a place where people lived. It looked like a battlefield that had existed for years. People were screaming. People were running. People were hiding. The sound of metal striking flesh echoed through the streets while the betting screens above us constantly updated the number of remaining participants. 407, 403. 398, 391. The numbers kept falling. I wanted no part of it. The moment the violence erupted, I ran. Not toward a weapon, not toward another contestant. I simply ran away from the square and into the abandoned streets surrounding it. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. The bruises from the beating earlier that evening were still fresh, and every step sent pain through my ribs. I turned into a narrow alley and hid behind an overturned delivery truck while trying to catch my breath. That was when I heard footsteps approaching. My entire body froze. A few seconds later, a young woman slowly stepped into the alley with her hands raised to show that she was unarmed. She could not have been older than 25. Her clothes were dirty and worn, and judging by her appearance, she had probably been living on the streets long before arriving here. She asked if I was alone. I told her that I was. She explained that she had no intention of fighting anyone and simply wanted somewhere safe to hide until the game ended. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Trust had already become dangerous. Eventually, she sat down several feet away from me and introduced herself as Elena, a former waitress who had lost her job, her apartment, and eventually everything else after medical bills destroyed her finances. Part of me wanted to believe she was telling the truth. Another part reminded me that trusting strangers inside a death game was probably a very stupid idea. Before either of us could continue talking, another voice called out from further down the alley. A large man in his 40s slowly approached us with both hands visible and explained that he had overheard our conversation. He introduced himself as Marcus and claimed he had been a construction worker before an accident left him unable to work and eventually homeless. 3 strangers. 3 desperate people. 3 people with absolutely no reason to trust one another. And yet somehow we ended up sitting together inside an abandoned alley while violence consumed the streets around us. The betting screens mounted throughout the town continued updating. 372 participants remaining. 364 participants remaining. 358 participants remaining. The killings were accelerating. Suddenly a loudspeaker announced that 20 minutes remained before the automated defenses would begin eliminating random participants. The announcement changed everything. Panic spread through the town. People who had spent the first part of the game hiding suddenly rushed into the streets searching desperately for targets. The sounds changed. Earlier there had been screaming and confusion. Now there was hunting. That was far worse. At one point we watched a man sprint past the alley while desperately looking over his shoulder. A few seconds later, 3 armed contestants followed him around the corner. The screaming lasted less than 10 seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Eventually Marcus quietly pointed out the reality none of us wanted to admit. If the timer expired before the numbers dropped low enough, any one of us could be selected for execution regardless of whether we had harmed anyone. For the first time that night, survival and morality stood directly opposite each other. Elena argued that killing innocent people would make us no better than the people running the games. Marcus argued that dead people do not get the luxury of keeping their principles. Neither of them was wrong. The timer above the town square dropped below 10 minutes. 327 participants remained alive. 27 people still needed to die. The streets erupted into complete madness. Groups attacked individuals. Friends turned against friends. People who had spent the last hour protecting each other suddenly began looking at one another differently. The betting spectators above us loved every second of it. The odds changed so quickly that some screens struggled to keep up. I remember looking toward one of the observation towers and seeing wealthy men applauding while waiters poured expensive drinks beside them. One spectator celebrated so loudly after several contestants died that people sitting beside him started laughing. To them, this was entertainment. To us, this was the end of the world. 5 minutes remained. 311 contestants remained alive. The loudspeaker announced that the automated defense systems had entered standby mode and would begin selecting targets if the required number of eliminations had not been reached before the timer expired. Suddenly, gun turrets emerged from several rooftops overlooking the streets. Red laser sights began sweeping across the town. People started crying. Others started praying. Some simply accepted whatever was coming. Then finally the number changed. 300 participants remaining. The sirens stopped. The laser sights disappeared. The loudspeaker congratulated the survivors for successfully completing the first game. Successfully. As if we had just finished an exam instead of witnessing over 100 deaths. Relief spread through the town almost immediately. Some people collapsed onto the ground crying. Others laughed hysterically. Several contestants hugged complete strangers simply because they were still alive. Then the screens updated once more. A list of names appeared. The names belonged to participants who had personally killed another contestant during the game. Beside each name appeared a reward amount based on betting performance and audience engagement. Some contestants had earned thousands of dollars during the first round alone. The spectators had apparently enjoyed their performances enough to tip them. That announcement scared me more than the killings. because it meant the organizers were not simply rewarding survival. They were rewarding brutality. And people who discover that violence pays well tend to become very violent very quickly. As the clock above the town reached 9:37 p.m., the loudspeaker informed us that the second game would begin in 23 minutes. The survivors were advised to use the remaining time wisely. Food stations had been placed throughout the town. Medical supplies were available in limited quantities. Temporary alliances were encouraged. The phrase temporary alliances stayed in my mind. Not alliances. Temporary alliances. Even the people running this nightmare understood something that I was only beginning to learn. In a place where only one person can survive, every friendship comes with an expiration date. The 23 minutes between the first and second games felt strangely peaceful, despite the bodies still lying throughout the town. People sat beside strangers sharing food while pretending they had not spent the last hour watching each other die. Others searched abandoned buildings for supplies that might increase their chances of surviving whatever came next. Several contestants had already started forming larger groups after realizing that numbers offered protection, at least for the moment. The organizers understood human nature better than any of us. Give desperate people a common enemy and they become allies. Remind those same people that only one of them can survive, and eventually they become enemies again. Marcus, Elena, and I spent most of the break inside an abandoned pharmacy near the edge of town. The building had already been stripped of most useful supplies years earlier, but someone had left behind bandages and disinfectant in a storage cabinet near the back room. Elena cleaned the cuts on my face, while Marcus wrapped the bruised area around my ribs as carefully as possible. The three of us barely knew each other, yet somehow they were showing me more kindness than I had received from most people throughout my entire life. Marcus eventually admitted that he had a daughter somewhere in another country, and that the money represented his final chance to see her again before she grew old enough to forget his face. Elena explained that her younger brother needed surgery she could never afford, and that she had accepted the invitation, believing the games would probably be some kind of television competition. As for me, I told them the truth. I had no family waiting for me, no future waiting for me, no home waiting for me. I simply wanted a chance to stop surviving and finally start living. For a few minutes, it almost felt normal. Three strangers sitting together in an abandoned building, sharing stories while the night continued outside. Then the speakers activated again. The second game would begin in 5 minutes. All remaining participants were instructed to move toward the center district immediately. Failure to comply would result in execution. The streets filled with survivors moving toward the town center under the watchful eyes of armed guards standing on rooftops above us. By the time we arrived, nearly 300 exhausted contestants stood waiting beneath the giant screens. The voice announced that the second game would be called The Divide. The rules were simple. Participants would have exactly 5 minutes to form teams of 4. Once the timer expired, anyone without a complete team would be executed immediately. Panic spread through the crowd almost instantly. Groups started forming everywhere. Friends searched desperately for one another. Strangers negotiated alliances within seconds of meeting. People pushed and shouted while trying to avoid becoming one of the unlucky contestants left standing alone when the countdown reached 0. Fortunately, our group already contained 3 members. We only needed one more. That was when we met Daniel. He looked to be somewhere in his late 20s and carried himself differently from everyone else. Unlike most contestants, he appeared calm. Too calm. He explained that he had worked as a paramedic before losing everything after an addiction destroyed his career and relationships. He looked exhausted, broken, human. Most importantly, he looked trustworthy. That would become my third mistake. The timer reached 0. The remaining contestants without teams collapsed almost immediately after sniper fire erupted from rooftops surrounding the square. Bodies hit the pavement in every direction. Nobody screamed this time. Nobody begged. By then we had all learned that the organizers never made empty threats. The voice congratulated the surviving teams before explaining the actual game. Each team would receive a key. Somewhere within the abandoned town existed a locked safe corresponding to that key. The first 50 teams to locate their safe and retrieve the object inside would advance. Everyone else would be eliminated. The game began immediately. Our group ran. For nearly 40 minutes we searched buildings, apartments, offices, and abandoned stores, while listening to distant gunshots echo through the town around us. Eventually, Daniel discovered our safe hidden inside the basement of an old school building. For a moment, we celebrated. For a moment, we forgot where we were. Then Marcus opened the safe. Inside sat a single revolver containing 1 bullet, nothing else. No money, no instructions, no explanation. Several seconds later, the speakers activated once more. The voice calmly explained that only 3 members from each team could proceed to the next round. 1 member needed to be sacrificed. The chosen participant had to die using the weapon provided inside the safe. Failure to complete the requirement within 15 minutes would result in the elimination of all team members. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The room felt smaller with every passing second. Marcus argued that there had to be another solution. Elena began crying. Daniel remained unusually quiet. The timer continued counting down. 10 minutes, 9 minutes, 8 minutes. Eventually, Daniel suggested that the oldest member of the group should volunteer because younger participants statistically had a better chance of surviving the remaining games. Marcus immediately refused. He argued that nobody deserved to die simply because they were older. The argument continued as the clock moved closer to 0. Then everything changed. Without warning, Daniel grabbed the revolver from Marcus's hands and fired. The sound inside the basement was deafening. Marcus collapsed instantly. For several seconds, none of us moved. Neither Elena nor I could process what had happened. Daniel looked down at Marcus's body before calmly explaining that indecision would have killed all 4 of us, and that somebody eventually needed to make the difficult choice. The doors of the basement unlocked immediately. The game considered the requirement fulfilled. Daniel had saved our lives. Daniel had murdered the first person who had shown me kindness that night. Both statements were true at the same time. As we stepped back onto the streets above us, I looked at Daniel differently, not because he had killed someone. By then, I had already seen dozens of deaths. What frightened me was how quickly he had made the decision. What frightened me was how little emotion appeared on his face afterward. The betting screens exploded with activity. Daniel's survival odds rose dramatically. Apparently, the audience loved decisive contestants. One wealthy spectator even awarded him a bonus for exceptional entertainment value. That was the moment I realized the true purpose of the games. The organizers were not trying to discover who could survive. They were trying to discover how long it took ordinary people to stop being ordinary. As the clock reached 11:04 p.m. and the survivors prepared for the third game, I looked at Marcus's blood still drying on my hands and wondered how much of my humanity I would still possess by sunrise. Deep down, I already knew the answer. Probably less than I wanted to admit. By the time the second game ended, the abandoned town had become almost unrecognizable. Bodies lined the streets. Broken windows covered the roads. Blood-stained walls that had probably not seen another human being in decades before that night. The strangest part was how normal everything was beginning to feel. A few hours earlier, I would have vomited at the sight of a corpse lying in the middle of the road. Now I simply stepped around them and kept walking. That realization scared me more than anything else, because if horror becomes normal, then something inside you has already started dying. The giant screens updated once again. 201 participants remained alive. 201 out of more than 400. The night was not even halfway over. The wealthy spectators above us seemed happier than ever. The betting markets had become increasingly aggressive as contestants developed reputations. Some participants became favorites because of their intelligence. Others because of their strength. Some because of their willingness to kill. Daniel had become one of those favorites. His odds continued improving after what happened in the basement. Every time his face appeared on the screens, new bets appeared beside his name. The audience loved predators. Predators made good entertainment. The speakers activated once again. The third game would begin immediately. The game was called The Hunt. The rules were simple. 20 participants would be selected as prey. The remaining contestants would become hunters. The prey would receive a 5-minute head start before being released into the abandoned town. If at least one prey survived until midnight, every surviving prey participant would automatically advance to the next round. Hunters who successfully killed a prey participant would receive immunity for the next game and substantial financial bonuses based on audience betting. The selected prey participants were instructed to step forward. A few seconds later, my face appeared on the giant screen. So did Elena's. Daniel's did not. I still remember the expression on his face when he realized what that meant. He would be hunting us. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he promised that he would not come after us. He promised he would hunt someone else if he absolutely had to. I believed him. That was mistake number 4. The countdown began. 5 minutes. 4 minutes. 3 minutes. The 20 of us scattered into the darkness. Elena and I ran toward the residential district where abandoned houses filled narrow streets that provided plenty of hiding places. For almost 30 minutes, everything remained quiet. too quiet. Then the hunting began. Gunshots echoed through the town. Screams followed shortly afterward. The betting screens updated constantly. 19 prey remaining. 17 prey remaining. 15 prey remaining. The hunters were finding us. At one point, Elena and I hid beneath the floorboards of an abandoned grocery store while footsteps moved through the building above us. Several contestants entered. Several left. One never made it out. The screaming lasted longer than I wanted it to. Eventually, the footsteps disappeared. Midnight was approaching. Only 7 prey remained alive. Then we heard someone calling our names. Daniel. Relief flooded through me immediately. He had found us. More importantly, he had found us before anyone else had. He explained that several hunting groups were moving toward our position and that we needed to relocate immediately. Without hesitation, we followed him. He led us through narrow streets before eventually stopping near an old apartment complex. That was when everything changed. 3 armed hunters stepped out from behind a nearby vehicle. They already knew where we were. Daniel had brought them to us. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Daniel looked directly at me and explained that survival required sacrifices and that if he refused to adapt, somebody else would simply make the same decision against him later. Elena started backing away. One of the hunters grabbed her immediately. She screamed my name. I still hear it sometimes. Daniel avoided looking at either of us as he accepted the protection token the hunters offered him in exchange for information about our location. He had traded us for immunity. He had traded us for better betting odds. He had traded us for survival. I ran. I did not think. I did not plan. I simply ran. Gunshots echoed behind me. I never looked back. I do not know whether Elena died immediately or whether she suffered first. Part of me hopes it was quick. Another part of me knows this place was not interested in mercy. The clock eventually struck midnight. 4 prey survived. Against every probability, I was one of them. The game ended. The hunters lowered their weapons. The speakers congratulated the surviving prey participants for providing exceptional entertainment value to the audience. Entertainment value. That phrase again. The wealthy spectators applauded from above as if they had just watched a good performance at a theater. The betting winners celebrated. The betting losers complained. Some ordered more drinks. Some increased their wagers for the next round. Down below, people were still bleeding to death in the streets. The contrast made me sick. As contestants gathered once more in the town square, I searched the crowd and eventually found Daniel standing alone. For several seconds, we stared at each other. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us needed to. The games had finally taught me their most important lesson. Trust is expensive. Inside that town, trust was fatal. As the giant screens updated for the next round, one number immediately caught my attention. 127 participants remained alive. Less than 1/3 of the original contestants were still standing. It was only midnight. 5.5 hours remained before sunrise. 5.5 hours remained before one person walked away with $10 million. 5.5 hours remained before the games finally finished turning us into monsters. By the time the clock struck 12:30 in the morning, the abandoned town no longer resembled a place where human beings lived. It resembled a graveyard that had forgotten to bury its dead. The streets that had once been filled with over 400 frightened contestants were now almost empty, except for the occasional survivor moving carefully between buildings, while constantly checking rooftops, windows, and alleyways for movement. Every shadow looked dangerous. Every sound felt like a warning. Every person still alive had proven one thing: they were capable of surviving. Inside that town, surviving usually meant somebody else had failed to. The speakers eventually announced the current number of contestants remaining. 127. I remember hearing the number and struggling to understand how more than 280 people had disappeared in less than 4 hours. Then I remembered the screams, the gunshots, the betrayals. Suddenly the number made perfect sense. The 4th game began at exactly 12:45. The organizers called it the offering. The rules were simple enough to understand and horrifying enough to destroy whatever humanity still remained inside the contestants. Food stations and medical stations would be open throughout the town. The supplies inside would only be enough for 60 contestants. Everyone else would receive nothing. The game would last 45 minutes. Those who failed to obtain supplies would enter the next rounds injured, starving, exhausted, and disadvantaged. The wealthy spectators loved it immediately. The betting numbers exploded across the screens above us. People were not betting on who would survive anymore. They were betting on who would break first. The locations of the supply stations appeared on every screen throughout the town. The moment they appeared, contestants began sprinting. I ran too. For the first time that night, I stopped pretending I was different from everyone else. I stopped pretending morality would somehow protect me. I stopped pretending kindness would somehow be rewarded. The nearest supply station was located inside an abandoned supermarket near the center of town. By the time I arrived, dozens of contestants were already fighting near the entrance. Not killing, not yet, just pushing, punching, scrambling. People who had once been teachers, mechanics, waitresses, fathers, mothers, and students were now clawing at each other over bottles of water and bandages. Then someone pulled a knife. After that, everything collapsed. I managed to force my way inside and grab whatever supplies I could carry. Water, bandages, painkillers, canned food. I turned toward the exit and almost ran directly into Daniel. For a moment, neither of us moved. He looked worse than the last time I had seen him. His face was bruised. Blood covered one sleeve of his jacket. His eyes looked older, not physically older, just tired. The kind of tired that settles somewhere deep inside a person. He looked at the supplies in my hands before quietly explaining that he had not managed to get anything. He asked if I was willing to share. For a brief moment, I saw the man who had helped bandage my injuries inside the pharmacy. Then I remembered Elena. I remembered Marcus. I remembered being sold to hunters like livestock. I told him no. His expression changed immediately. Not anger. Not disappointment. Understanding. He simply nodded and stepped aside. As I walked away, I realized something that frightened me more than the games themselves. A few hours earlier, I would have shared without hesitation. Now I could not even recognize the person making my decisions anymore. The fifth game began shortly after 2 a.m. The organizers called it the divide. Contestants would enter pairs. Only one person from each pair would leave. No weapons would be provided. No rules would exist. The winner would simply be the person still standing when the doors opened again. The pairings appeared on the giant screens. My opponent was Daniel. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. Out of every remaining contestant in the town, somehow I had been paired with the only person I still knew. The only person left from the beginning. We were escorted into an abandoned restaurant and the doors locked behind us. For almost a minute, neither of us moved. Daniel eventually admitted that he regretted what happened with Elena and Marcus. He explained that fear had convinced him that surviving mattered more than anything else. He explained that every decision he made afterward became easier than the last. Then he looked directly at me and told me something I still remember, years later. He told me that the games never forced anyone to become monsters. The games simply created a place where becoming a monster was rewarded. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then he attacked. Not because he hated me, not because he wanted to hurt me, because he wanted to live. The fight felt endless. Tables shattered. Glass broke. Blood covered the floor. At some point, he managed to throw me through a broken doorway, and for several seconds, I genuinely believed I was about to die. Then I saw the metal pipe lying beside me. When he rushed toward me again, I swung. Once, then twice, then a third time. Eventually, he stopped moving. The silence afterward felt louder than the fight itself. The doors opened. The speakers congratulated me on advancing to the final stages of the competition. I looked down at Daniel lying on the floor and realized something horrifying. I was not crying. I was not shaking. I was not even surprised. The games had finally succeeded. The orphan who entered that town earlier that night would have been horrified by what he had become. The man standing there at 2:30 in the morning barely felt anything at all. When I returned to the town square, only 20 contestants remained alive. 20 out of 412. 3 hours remained before sunrise. 3 hours remained before somebody won $10 million. 3 hours remained before I learned whether there was still enough humanity left inside me to recognize the person staring back from the mirror. At that moment, I was no longer sure I wanted the answer. When the giant screens updated again and displayed the number 20, the entire town fell silent. 20 contestants remained alive. 20 people out of 412. 20 people out of the frightened crowd that had stood together in the town square only a few hours earlier while trying to convince themselves that the organizers were bluffing. By then, nobody believed in bluffing anymore. The streets were almost empty. The abandoned town had become exactly what it was always designed to become. A cemetery with electricity. The speakers activated once again and informed us that the remaining 5 games would be accelerated due to the reduced number of contestants. The audience had apparently enjoyed the night's performances enough to approve a fast conclusion. Performances. That was what they called them. Not lives. Not deaths. Performances. The sixth game forced contestants to cross the entire town while avoiding automated turrets and hidden sniper positions that activated at random intervals. The seventh game involved choosing whether to keep medical supplies for ourselves or surrender them to injured contestants in exchange for temporary protection tokens. The eighth game divided the remaining survivors into groups and forced us to vote on which member of each group would be eliminated. By the end of those 3 games, only 6 contestants remained alive. I was one of them. I wish I could say I survived because I was smarter. I wish I could say I survived because I was stronger. The truth was much simpler. I survived because luck occasionally stood beside me while death chose someone else. The 9th game began shortly after 4 in the morning. The organizers called it judgment. Each remaining contestant was brought before the wealthy spectators watching from above, while our actions throughout the night were displayed on giant screens surrounding the town. Every decision, every betrayal, every kill, every moment of weakness, every moment of cruelty. The audience discussed us the same way investors discuss stocks. One wealthy man argued that I lacked the aggression necessary to win the final round. Another pointed out that my survival instincts had improved dramatically throughout the night, and that contestants who adapted quickly usually performed well near the end. Performed well, as if surviving hell was some kind of talent show. The betting reached ridiculous numbers. Millions of dollars changed hands in minutes. One spectator reportedly wagered enough money on the final outcome to feed the entire refugee camp where I grew up for decades. That realization made me angrier than anything else that happened that night. The amount of money being casually thrown around by people watching us die was enough to save thousands of lives. Instead, it was being used for entertainment. By 4:30, only 2 contestants remained. Me, and a woman named Sophia. I had seen her several times throughout the night, but we had never spoken. She looked exhausted, older than when she arrived. Not physically older, just worn down by the weight of surviving. The final game began at exactly 4:45. There would be no weapons, no puzzles, no complicated rules. The last person standing would win. That was all. Sophia looked at me and asked whether I had family waiting for me outside. I told her I did not. Then I asked the same question. She explained that she had 2 children, and that every decision she made that night had been for them. For several seconds, neither of us moved. We were both waiting for the other person to attack first. Eventually she did. The fight itself felt unreal. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was sad. Neither of us hated the other. Neither of us wanted revenge. Neither of us wanted violence. We simply wanted to survive. At one point, we both collapsed from exhaustion and simply stared at each other from opposite sides of the street while trying to recover enough energy to continue. The audience watched silently. Even they seemed to understand that this was no longer entertainment. This was desperation in its purest form. Eventually, the fight ended. I won. Even now, I still cannot decide whether that was a victory. The giant clock above the town read exactly 5:30 a.m. 9 hours. From 8:30 p.m. until 5:30 a.m. 9 hours that somehow felt longer than the rest of my life combined. The speakers congratulated me for becoming the winner of the games. The floodlights switched off one by one. The betting screens disappeared. The wealthy spectators began leaving their observation towers as casually as people leaving a football stadium after a match. Some looked happy. Some looked disappointed. Some were already discussing next year's games before they had even reached their vehicles. To them, the night was over. To me, it was only beginning. The man with the hat eventually approached me once again. He congratulated me on my victory and informed me that the agreed prize money had already been transferred into an account created under my name. $10 million. $10 million for 9 hours of hell. $10 million for 411 graves. $10 million for memories that still wake me up in the middle of the night. He asked whether I believed it had been worth it. I remember looking around at the empty streets and abandoned buildings while the first sunlight of morning slowly climbed over the horizon. Then I gave him the only honest answer I have ever given in my life. I told him that I honestly did not know. The money changed everything afterward. I bought a house. I left the refugee camp forever. I never worried about food again. For the first time in my life, the world finally stopped feeling like it was trying to kill me. But every night when I close my eyes, I still see the town. I still hear the gunshot that killed the first man who tried to escape. I still remember Marcus lying on the basement floor. I still remember Elena screaming my name. I still remember Daniel telling me that the games did not create monsters. They simply rewarded them. Sometimes I wake up in my expensive house, and have to remind myself that I am no longer there. Sometimes I look in the mirror and wonder whether the person staring back at me ever truly left that town at all. Because the truth is that I did not escape the games at 5:30 that morning. The games escaped with me. And some nights, when the house is quiet and sleep refuses to come, I find myself wondering something that scares me more than the town ever did. If the man with the hat knocked on my door tomorrow and offered me another chance to play, would I refuse? Or would the part of me that survived until sunrise already know the answer? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Also, leave a comment below. What do you think you would have done if you were in my shoes?